This right here is the Acceltra Prime, one of the most loved rifles in Warframe, super strong, and next week it's gonna be vaulted. That's why in this video, I'm gonna show you what the Acceltra Prime can do and how to build it properly, so you can decide for yourself if you maybe want to go for a last-minute farming run this weekend. As always, a big shout out to all our lovely channel members, and now, let's jump right into it. But alright, what's even going on with the whole weapon will be gone thing? Well, pretty simple. Next week on Wednesday, that's the 10th of December, Warframe will launch its next update, which will also include Gyre Prime, and as is usually the case, whenever a new Prime gets introduced into the game, an old Prime will be vaulted. When we're looking at this table right here from the Warframe wiki, then this to-be-vaulted Warframe should be Gauss, and of course that means the Acceltra Prime and the Icarius Prime will join him. In case you want to do a last-minute weekend farming run, then this right here in the background, these are all the relics that can contain parts for the Acceltra Prime. Of course, the weapon being vaulted does not mean that it will be taken completely out of the game. You can still run the relics that you have and also trade for parts with other players. But still, in this video, I'm going to show you what the Acceltra Prime is capable of, so you can decide for yourself if it is worth farming it or not. But, as always, let's talk about what the Acceltra Prime even is and how it works. The Acceltra Prime is a fully automatic assault rifle firing mini rockets that will explode on impact in a 5-meter AoE. When we're looking at the stats, then we see a big focus on crit, very high crit chance and crit damage. However, the status chance, while 18% is certainly not bad, it also isn't high enough to make the Acceltra a true god weapon. The only stat here that is truly scary is the maximum ammo capacity, because this little number here is critically low and we will have to do something about it. Just one more thing before we go on. While yes, the Acceltra fires rockets that explode on impact, if you are too close to the explosion, then it's just simply not gonna happen. So make sure to always keep a safe distance. And as always, if you could maybe spare a little like for the video, that would be really helpful with the YouTube algorithm gods, so cheers so much for your support. But okay, how about we now start talking about the one thing that you're actually here for, and that would be the builds. But before we get into the builds themselves, there is one specific mod that plays a very important role on the Acceltra that we need to talk about beforehand, and that would be primary acuity. See, what this mod says is that when you install it on a weapon, you can't modify the multi-shot, so that will be locked at 1, but in exchange, you get a whopping plus 350% to both weak point damage as well as weak point crit chance. Unfortunately though, it's not that simple. First of all, let's talk about the crit part. If you saw an Acceltra video in the past, then there's a good chance you saw this little weapon deal easy tier 2 or even tier 3 red crits. That was because of primary acuity and because the plus 350% crit chance to weak spots was multiplicative to other sources of crit chance. This interaction was only happening on a couple of weapons, the Acceltra being one of them, and it was not intentional, which is the reason why in the meantime this has been fixed. As it stands right now, the crit chance bonus from primary acuity works just like normal other crit chance mods. Pretty sad for the Acceltra lovers, I gotta admit that was pretty cool. But if you thought that these crit chance shenanigans were already spaghetti Cody, then wait until we get into the weak point damage, because there is quite a lot to unpack here. First of all, this damage bonus is no base damage bonus, it's no separate multiplier. No, this weak point damage bonus is applied to the weak point multiplier that you get, whenever you hit a head or an enemy's weak point. And according to the wiki, it's apparently also not plus 350% like it says on the mod, but 1.5 times that, so actually plus 525%. And if you think that's a lot, then that's still not it, because on top of all that, the weak point damage is multiplicative with bonuses to headshot multipliers, like for example primary deadhead. So, long story short, what does all of this mean? Well, primary acuity is unfortunately not broken strong on the Acceltra anymore, as it used to be in the past with the crit, but still, on crit-focused weapons, it still deals massive damage, especially when paired with primary deadhead. But alright, with that being said now, let's finally get into the builds themselves, and here I have actually quite a lot prepared for you. Some of them need specific synergies, and others are kinda able to stand on their own. So let's get right into it, starting out with this one right here. This is sort of the legacy build, the way that we used to play the Acceltra in the past, and that is a Hunter Munitions / damage over time build. Now, the idea here is that given the fact that the Acceltra has very good crit performance, but with 18% not that much of a high status chance, we can't really rely on our status chance for a good damage over time build. That's why we use Hunter Munitions, which can turn critical hits into / damage over times, so we're kind of outsourcing our status application to the crit stat this way. Then we combine that with Viral, because Viral makes enemies weaker, using Malignant Force as well as Rhyme rounds. And then because it is a status over time build, we naturally have to have an Elementalist mod. Without an Elementalist mod, this build just doesn't work. And faction damage. Here, I'm using a faction damage mod. If you don't like that, then you can also use Rhino's Roar as an infusion on whichever Warframe you play this with. The rest then is pretty simple. Galvanized Chamber for more multi-shot, so more status application. Crit chance, crit damage. I should say though, right, with the forma that I used here, critical delay was just the better fit. You could also use point strike, or if you're really wild, go for galvanized scope even. Critical delay is not an absolute must. What is an absolute must though is Vigilante Supplies or a Rifle Ammo Mutation mod, because specifically with this build you're spraying quite a lot, and without any source of ammo mutation, you're gonna be in ammo trouble big time. As Arcane, we go with Primary Merciless. This one will give us a total of plus 360% base damage, and yes, we very decidedly here do not use Primary Crux, because while it can give us up to 300% more status chance, in this build right here, we apply our damage over time effects with the crit, so the status chance would really only be for viral application, and the 40% that we have here is enough for what we're doing, so Primary Crux doesn't really help Hunter Munitions build in that sense. Overall, for the performance of this build, I would say it works when you're up against bigger groups of relatively weak enemies. However, the moment a big dude enters the room, or God forbid, an enemy that cannot have infinite status effects on them, that is where this build here really struggles, and nowadays in 2025, Hunter Munitions builds are not as strong anymore as they once were. So, what would you do instead if you want to have a spray and pray damage over time build? This right here is the answer. This is a normal blast build. Nothing really crazy to explain here, right? We go with Blast because Blast is a very strong element if you have a high fire rate and AoE applications and all that good stuff. Here we also go with Primary Crux because this time, right, we're actually trying to apply status effects through status chance, so the 300% this gives us is very good. Plus, that is the very nice part, we gain up to 60% ammo efficiency with this one too, specifically on a weapon like the Acceltra that eats ammo like there's no tomorrow. This is a big help, and I might even go so far to say that with Primary Crux, you could think about potentially dropping an ammo mutation mod if you have enough enemy density to fill you up normally. Also here, critical delay is not a must. You could go with point strike, because especially here, right, you're trying to have as much fire rate as possible. And with this build in specific, I would recommend maybe going for something like Arcane Acceleration on your Warframe as an external source of more fire rate. Just one very important thing I need to mention here, Galvanized Aptitude. The reason we have this on the build is obviously for the status chance, but I need to make very, very clear that the substat that gives us more damage depending on how many status effects are on the enemy, that damage bonus only applies if you hit the enemy directly with the bullet. If the enemy gets hit by the bullet explosion AoE, this bonus damage does not happen. It actually says it quite literally in the text, it only applies to direct damage, not to AoE damage. So if you wanted to, you could theoretically also go with Rifle Aptitude for that 10% extra status chance here. I think Galvanized Aptitude is still a bit of a stronger mod overall for those direct hits. That is something we need to know. But yeah, these were the two spray and pray builds. However, I have two more, and these are so much stronger in their performance. So how about we talk about Acuity builds for a minute? What you're seeing right here is a primary acuity-based build, and this one is a direct damage build going for pure corrosive, completely ignoring status chance, just trying to deal as much damage as possible. What we're doing here, of course, is primary acuity for that weak point damage plus weak point critical chance that we talked about earlier, in combination with primary deadhead. Also, as we talked earlier, multiplicative scaling between these two here, which is very nice. And then because we have acuity, we don't go for multi-shot because, it is capped at 1. And for the rest of the build, we just double, triple stacking everything we can to get as much damage as possible. Serration for even more base damage, Galvanized Aptitude for even more base damage, because this build is meant to actually hit the enemy directly. That's what the acuity portion is for. That's why we actually do benefit quite a bit with this playstyle from Galvanized Aptitude 2. And because acuity forces us to go for weak point hits, we also use Galvanized Scope as our crit chance source, because this way we can get up to a maximum of plus 320% crit chance, which is, the best crit mod, at least in theory. If you don't like this idea, of course, you could always go Point Strike or Critical Delay. But let's now talk about the, in my opinion, most fun and most ridiculous build for the Acceltra at the moment, and that would be this right here. It's also an acuity build, but a blast one. The idea behind this is deal big damage with the acuity headshots and try to proc blast at the same time, because this way, when the enemy dies, it will deal AoE blast damage to all the enemies around it. If they have blast on themselves and they die, then the blast will trigger the AoE explosion. And this way, you can deal quite the sizable amount of AoE blast damage. Now, you might be wondering, and rightfully so, if this is a blast build, then where the heck is the blast on the build? There is absolutely no blast on this weapon whatsoever. So what's going on here? Well, to be 100% fair, this build right here is specific to only Lavos. The reason for that is that the base status chance of the Acceltra is just not high enough to naturally inflict enough blast for this entire thing to work here, which is why we're forced to play this with Lavos, because Lavos is the only Warframe in the game who can not only infuse elements on a weapon, but also make them force proc with every hit regardless of status chance by using his super strong augment Valence Formation. This way, we can ensure that even though we have a low status chance, every hit is gonna force proc blast, and with all the super duper freaking high damage that we have on this build right here, that means those blast hits are gonna be very strong, and we're just gonna deal so much AoE damage. It's really darn cool, and you should absolutely try this build. And if you want to know the top 10 primary weapons too, then you can find that video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Orzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Undercaneo2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantagas, Patrisator, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, Zengen, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.